The Iranian regime teeters, Israel's attorney general clamps down on yeshivas, and American anti-Semitism goes through the roof. In our world of headlines, breaking stories, and 24-hour coverage, it seems that more than ever we know what's going on. But amid the deluge of news, do we know the story? Beneath the clashes of geopolitics and controversies of Israel and the Jewish world lie deep roots, the crucial element of context. Join me, Gedalia Gutentag, as I go behind the times to explore the forgotten history, remarkable personalities, and transformative moments that shape current events and explain how we got here. Behind the Times with Gedalia Gutentag. It was late 1978 when a meeting was convened at the Manhattan headquarters of Agudas Yisrael of America to decide a question of life and death. What to do about Iran's Jews. Millions of Ayatollah Khomeini's Islamist supporters were demonstrating against the secular regime, defying the Shah's fearsome security services. And although many Western observers dismissed the possibility, the fall of the Shah himself seemed possible, and an ancient Jewish community was threatened. Amid few resources, the question was one of triage. Should the Aguda focus primarily on bringing over boys and girls to Torah institutions, as they had for a few years, or expand its operation to Hatzalah, broad-based rescue work? If the former, work and student visas would be confined to Torah institutions. If the latter, Agudas Yisrael would have to enlist non-Torah institutions as well. The issue was presented to the Moetzes Gedolei HaTorah of America as to whether Persian Jews should be encouraged to escape. What was the question? Well, on the one hand, observance in Iran was likely to remain traditional, and intermarriage was virtually non-existent. Whereas if they left, intermarriage rates would soar. On the other hand, no one could know what to expect under a radical Muslim regime. The issue had obvious Holocaust overtones, the same spiritual versus physical conundrums that had swirled in the years leading up to the war. Adding to the resonance of the meeting was the fact that some of those around the Agudas table, like Rabbi Moshe Grylak, head of Aguda himself, had first cut their teeth on Holocaust rescue work. Sitting around the long table in Aguda's room, as the Moetzes considered the issue, the Beluzhever Rebbe began to tremble. "I see 1939 before me again," he told the other participants. "I had one daughter and one granddaughter. We asked a shaila and were told to stay, and I lost my only daughter." The Beluzhever Rebbe refused to paskin. Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky gave the final ruling. Those coming to yeshivas should be encouraged to leave. For the others, no advice should be given. That dramatic scene, taken from Jonathan Rosenblum's magisterial biography of Rabbi Moshe Grylak, resonates today, almost 50 years later. Because amid a bloody crackdown ordered by Khomeini's successors, Jews are once again cut off behind an Iranian digital iron curtain. As the world waits to see whether Donald Trump will order his bombers once more into action, and whether the Revolutionary Guards will retaliate by rocketing Israel, history tells us that the face-off between Israel and Iran has far more to it than meets the eye. Because for years, these two mortal enemies traded and even sometimes allied behind the scenes. And as Jews and Shiite Muslims fought, they sometimes collaborated in the murky world of international politics. There's a story of the rescue of Iran's Jews, who are now spread out all over the world, many who went on from backgrounds with very little Jewish knowledge to become Rabbonim and Talmidei Chachamim. And beyond the news, perhaps the greatest current affairs story of today is, what's next? When the dust settles, will Iran's 50-year experiment with fundamentalist Islam crash and burn? And if so, what comes next? The lessons of history provide a glimpse into one of the major issues behind our times. For those who like royal pomp and circumstance, it's hard to beat the old British pathé footage of the crowning of the Shah. It's October the 26th, 1967, and in Tehran's Golestan Palace, the historic seat of Persian monarchy, the Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, is being crowned. In reality, Mohammad Reza Shah had actually ruled since 1941, but he delayed his coronation for more than 25 years, presenting the event as a symbolic moment. Iran, in his telling, had finally achieved stability, independence, and modernity worthy of a crowned monarchy. Well, that was 1967. Less than 13 years later, that would all be turned to ashes, and the Shah himself would have to flee. But that was all in the future, when in the glittering ceremony. And you can see this footage, and you see the palace halls which are transformed into a glittering imperial stage, with chandeliers blazing, walls heavy with mirrors and gold filigree. At the heart of the ceremony was the Pahlavi crown, created in 1967 for the Shah's father, Reza Shah. It was extremely ostentatious and designed to outshine, as it were, anything that Europe could produce. It was encrusted with diamonds, emeralds, pearls, and rubies, and topped with another massive emerald. And I suppose the emerald would have symbolized the Iranian monarchy itself, the Pahlavi dynasty, with a peacock throne, as Iran's traditional monarchy was called. All this pomp and ceremony was a visual claim that Persia was not merely just a country with a monarch, but an ancient empire stretching back thousands of years. Walking down the red carpet on that day, in a tiny little cute military uniform, was the sweet 7-year-old Crown Prince of Iran, who now known to the world as the Washington, D.C. resident Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi, who, as we speak, is trying to influence the anti-regime protests from thousands of miles away. And that footage, that Pathé footage, an incredible archive, shows this level of imperial splendor with the Crown Prince and his parents sitting on gold thrones. There's another element there, if you look, which is there's a very striking presence of red double-decker London buses going round in Tehran there. And they are an obvious part of the Shah's attempt to project a modern Western face. But what's significant about that footage is that very modernity would get the Shah in trouble, because Iranian society was actually very traditional. Outside the big cities, the Shah's modernization and secularism was resented, and it would lead to his downfall. But meanwhile, life was very good for Iran's Jews. Mishpacha's archives from 2018 have a very good interview by Barbara Ben-Susan with two Los Angeles-based rabbis, Rabbi David Shofet and Rabbi David Zargari from Beverly Hills and Pico, respectively. Just to give you a little bit of background to these out, because these two rabbis are going to be commentating a bit throughout and are present throughout this episode. Rabbi Shofet was the son of the former chief rabbi of Tehran and a son of a long line of rabbonim. He fled to Los Angeles in 1980. Rabbi Zargari came to Los Angeles 30 years. He's a different, younger generation. He left Iran as a young man just after the Six-Day War to study at the Hebrew University, and he thought he'd continue on to North America. Instead, he ended up under the wing of the legendary Persian Jewish activist and Ner Yisrael president, Rabbi Naftali Neuberger. Instead of becoming a businessman, Rabbi Zargari became a Talmud Chacham. Let's go back to Rabbi Shofet, because he describes his father, Rabbi Yedidia Shofet, was originally from a small city of Kashan in Isfahan in Iran, which was once a center of trade in silks and rugs and tapestries. Obviously, these are some products which are uniquely associated with Iran. And he says that the Jews didn't make the fabrics themselves. They were merchants and connoisseurs who created the market. So according to the Shofet family tradition, the family came to Persia from Spain. They were rabbis and dayanim for over 13 generations. His father knew the names of all his predecessors and wrote books and memoirs in Farsi. His father was close to Ben Ish Chai, obviously in neighboring Iraq. So a bit about Iranian Jewish history, because this is important over here. Jewish history in Iran dates back to biblical times. Obviously, when some of the exiled tribes settled in Syria and northern Iran, after the destruction of the Khurban Abayis, the remaining Jews were exiled, as we know, to the first Khurban, were exiled to Babylon, to Babel, and to Iraq, which was soon taken over by the Persian Empire. But since the end of that short-lived empire, the region saw one dynasty after another rise and fall. But then if you fast forward a number of centuries to the end of the 7th century, the Islamic conquest of Persia, when this great expansion under Muhammad and his successors led Islam to spread all over the world. So Islam has been one of the region's official religions. And for centuries, most of the population was Sunni, but the bloody Shiite conquest of Iran in the 15th century meant that many Jews were either forced to convert or live like Anusim, in the same way as happened in Spain. And Rabbi Shofet related that he had a friend called Dr. Amnon Netzer, taught at the Hebrew University, who went to villages in the Isfahan province, found many graves of Jews who'd been forced to convert. Obviously, this on and off conversion tells you something about the nature of life in Iran and that Jews were treated as second-class citizens. And we know later on that there were a unique group called the Anusei Mashhad, the forced converts, or the crypto-Jews of Mashhad. That took place in 1839 under the dynasty called the Qajars, who were very anti-Semitic and devout Muslims, and the Jewish community of Mashhad was forced to choose between death and conversion. And in fact, what the entire community did was publicly embraced Islam and became known as Jadid al-Islam, New Muslims, which has obviously got overtones of the new Christians, the conversos of what happened in Ferdinand and Isabella's Spain. But what was unique about the Mashhadi community was that unlike other crypto-Jews who kind of eventually intermarried or just became cut off from the main body of the Jewish people, the Mashhadi Anusim didn't. And what happened was that they were able to live secretly as Jews. They kept Shabbos, Kashrus, had Shechita. They conducted Jewish marriages in secret, preserved the Hebrew names at home. And then from the late 19th century, early 20th century, they started to migrate to places where they could once again keep Yiddishkeit, return to open observance of Judaism. And they went to places like Bukhara, Samarkand, later Tehran, but also to Yerushalayim. And it's in Yerushalayim that they encounter the Anusei Mashhad. They moved there as communities. They encounter a lot of suspicion from the Yerushalmi Rabbonim who can't understand who are these Muslims moving in and pretending to be Jews. Until that the Yerushalmi Rabbonim discovered that the Mashhadi Jews had managed to avoid intermarriage. They'd managed to preserve their autonomy. And apparently the way they did that was because they lived in these compounds surrounded by high walls. I suppose one way, for those who know, the Bote Ungarin, built in a similar way in which you have a high outside walls, and the community life was happening inside the walls, which enabled them to practice Shechita and enabled them to have their own Rabbonim. And in fact, they were able to avoid intermarriage because of the Muslim practice of, marrying young. So the Jews were able to say every time some Muslim said, hey, what about your daughter to my son? They said, well, actually, she's long married, because they would get the kids off married very, very young, even as babies, if I'm not mistaken. And that was the way they got around them. So they arrived in Yerushalayim and they were gradually accepted as Jews because they'd managed to preserve their Jewish autonomy. So that was the Iranian Jewish history in which ancient tolerance had given way to persecution and even forced conversion. And that leads us to what is happening in the 20th century when the Shahs rise. Because what has happened, Shah is just Persian for king, and the king of kings, which is what the Pahlavis took the thing, was Shahanshah, the king of kings. The Pahlavis came to power in 1921 in a coup staged against the Qajar dynasty, or as we said, anti-Semites. And they emerged as the leaders of Iran. Reza Shah, it's important to remember because these names come over and over again. Reza Shah first comes to power in a coup in 1921, he's a strong man, later becomes prime minister in 1923, assumes the throne in 1925 when whatever passes for their governing council deposes the Qajar dynasty, proclaims his Shah, and he was crowned in 1926. Now, actually what happens is Reza Shah, first in the dynasty, is forced to resign or to abdicate in 1941 in favor of his son, because he got caught up in the great power struggle of the Second World War, and he had a policy of strict neutrality, I suppose, a bit like the Swiss or others as well. But because Britain was then the power in the Middle East and next door in Iraq, and on the other side there was the Soviet Union, they both invaded Iran in 1941 because they feared Reza Pahlavi's or Reza Shah's ties to Germany. And remember, these are the vital Persian oil fields and supply route, which threatened the Allied war effort. So Reza Pahlavi didn't have a strong army. The army was to come later by his son, and that's what we're about to get to. But he didn't have a military to speak of, and he was viewed by the Allies as unreliable, so he was basically toppled, and the British and the Soviet Union said, okay, out with the old, in with the new being Reza Shah's son, Mohammad Reza Shah, and he was pro-Allies as opposed to pro-Axis. So it's actually in that period where basically the British and the Soviets are now governing, as it were, effectively Iran through Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, that one of these episodes comes up that is very well known and is controversial, called Yaldei Tehran, as opposed to, that's not the Yaldei Teiman, the Yemenite children, it's the Yaldei Tehran, the Tehran children. There were several hundred Jewish children, mostly from Poland, who escaped eastward from Soviet labor camps during World War II, reached Tehran in 1942-43, after Reza Shah has abdicated, as I said, in 1941, and Iran is now under Allied occupation. And Tehran becomes a key refugee hub along the Persian corridor, and from there, the children are directed by Jewish and various flavors of Zionist groups, transferred to Mandate-era Palestine 1943. So obviously that's a byproduct of Reza Shah's fall and the rise of Mohammad Reza Shah, which led to part of the Allied control of Iran and Iran's role as a wartime transit zone. The reason that it was a controversy was because who were the Zionist groups who took them? It was kind of Jewish agency. They were taking these from children from Poland, and they ended up in the talons of the Jewish agency with unfortunate effects for their religiosity, because it was a battle to try and get them into religious institutions, which is for another time. But that is exactly what's happening as Reza Shah is forced to abdicate. Mohammad Reza Shah takes over. And there's another thing, a twist of history. Because, did you know that in my best Scottish accent, did you know that one of the other people to come along through this route, through Iran, out of Russia and into Palestine, was none other than the future Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin. He comes in, I think, General Anders' army, which forms inside the Soviet Union in the war, but then decamps to Palestine, the Soviet orbit, and then once they're in Palestine, slips off his army uniform and joins the underground and is live in Palestine. So that was on the corridor over there. That was happening then precisely because of the fall of Reza Pahlavi. Anyway, what happens is, and it's good to backpedal a bit to when Reza becomes, in the coup, when he takes over, that initiates and inaugurates a big change in Iran, because Reza Pahlavi, unlike the Qajar dynasty, is a modernizer, a reformer. And he vastly improves life for those who want modernity and reform, including the country's Jews. And Rabbi Shofet says that the Jews came out of the ghetto. They could study in universities and become industrialists. And as everywhere, as he says, Jews took advantage of the new opportunities more than anyone. And in fact, I think that's an accurate reflection of what the Jews, more than anyone, did extremely well in Iran. And for them, it was a disaster. The fall, obviously, it's the age-old sad story of Jewish success in, the ghetto walls falling. You come into modernity, and then the spiritual struggles start. Because many Iranian Jewish children leave the ghetto, as it were. There wasn't really a ghetto, but anyway, go to Alliance schools, the French secularist schools, Alliance Universelle Israélite Universelle, known as KIAC, Kol Yisrael Chavirim, which operate right across the Arab and Muslim world and, are forces of major secularism. And young people went abroad, often to the US, to train for professions and returned all the more westernized. And Rabbi Shofet says it reached a point where in Tehran there were maybe 10 Shomer Shabbos families out of 80,000 people. Those are pretty significant numbers and show you where things have got to. But Jews, and this is again a classic big city, small village and small town divide, because the Jews in the smaller cities always remain more religious. And obviously this reflects the divide between a metropolis and outlying areas that is going to be at the heart of the revolt against the Shah himself. Rabbi Shofet says, we didn't have yeshivot like in Europe. The small cities had Batei Medrash with the rabbis teaching in them. Yeshivas trained people to be teachers of Torah. This is so classic across many, many areas, Turkey as well. The salaries were low, so many people left. In other words, level of Yiddishkeit was very low. That was going to be this part of the story over here. So, what was it like then under the Shah? So the Shah, although he was good to the Jews, he never normalized relations. He didn't recognize the state of Israel. He is, after all, a Muslim country, and this is 1948. When the state of Israel was established, Iran quietly cooperated with Israel on joint military and agricultural projects. And we're going to see this increase as the Pahlavi regime, government, and system comes under threat. But so Jews weren't forced to flee as they were in neighboring Iraq, where you had the Farhud, which is this terrible pogrom, in which led to basically the entire Jewish community just terrorized into leaving. Many did come to live in Eretz Israel, but at the time, Iranian Jews were happy to stay put. And in the 1960s, writes Barbara Ben-Susan, only about 50 Iranian families were living in Los Angeles. Jimmy Delshad, a Persian Jew who in 2007 became the first Iranian-American mayor of Beverly Hills, said that he told an interviewer that he knew barely a dozen families when he arrived from Shiraz in Iran in 1959. The Iranian exodus didn't happen, obviously, until the rise of radical Islam in the late 1970s. For me, 3 AP, Associated Press, pictures capture the drama of what happened next. One of them shows the Ayatollah Khomeini, stern-faced, being greeted as he descends from an Air France plane. For me, that shows how the modern world, essentially the French state and much of liberal world opinion, ushered in and took part in the ascent of these medieval radicals. That's one element. There's another picture. The other picture is a fragile and regal-looking Shah and his wife at the airport on the way out into exile, from which he never came back. Now, the Shah, people didn't know at the time, he hid this even from his closest advisors. The Shah had cancer. He was weakened, and he's an imperial-looking figure. But in this picture, a soldier is bending down to kiss his shoe, and the Shah's wife is smiling. And that, for me, indicates the way to which this regime had a certain level of support. But genuinely, the Shah and his supporters could not believe what had befallen them, the way that their entire power had been wiped out overnight by these radicals from overseas. The third picture shows Khomeini surrounded by a few clerics in these tan type of robes. But around him is a sea of saluting and cheering men. And many of them, most of them, are dressed in a Western fashion. And that, for me, is a remarkable portrayal and depiction of the way that Khomeinism and the revolution transcended. It wasn't just the religious conservatives. The appeal went far broader than that. Khomeini's appeal, what happens? He comes from Iran, and at a certain stage in the 60s starts speaking out and writing in increasingly radical ways, challenging the legitimacy of the Shah and saying that he's a usurper, he's Western, he's secular. And he starts building a follower, and eventually he's exiled internally within Iran and then overseas to Paris. And from Paris, organizes a massive movement that eventually overthrows the Shah and brings him back in triumph as a leader. What was his appeal? His appeal was very broad. He didn't speak of his true radicalism, but he spoke to the urban religious poor and to rural traditionalists, those, like we said before, those who are outside the main cities, and they did not like the modernization and secularization. He spoke to the bazaris, the merchant class, in which he promised order and protection of small property and relief from corrupt state capitalism. And it's very important to know that the signs that this revolution is different. The scenes that we're seeing start in the bazaar, these merchants in central Tehran who were a base for the Khomeinist revolution. And their turning on the regime for economic reasons is a big sign of the erosion of the regime's legitimacy. But back to 1979, in the rise of Khomeini, he was speaking to them. He got them on board, and he said, when revolutionaries bring the business people on board, that is when they demonstrate depth of their support. And he obviously brought online clerics as well who did not like the secularization, but he spoke to students, leftists and intellectuals, and tapped into this whole vein of anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism, in which he was able to portray and paint the Shah's regime as being something imposed from the outside, by being something Western, being something a colonial project. And so that last thing had a lot of resonance, and it resonates deep till today, to the point where we see it's a very interesting thing. We talk today about the way in which mainstream media, liberal media, have failed really to speak up about this. They speak about the Palestinians all day. We know what damage they've done over that. But they are keeping the left-wing media, whether it's the BBC, which is following it, but in a kind of non-urgent way, nothing like the urgency of Gaza. If you read the world's biggest left-leaning outlets, you will see that if they're covering this, they're not covering it with any great enthusiasm. And this goes back to the fact that in the 60s and the 70s, when Khomeini was broadcasting his tremendously vitriolic anti-regime propaganda, he was given a platform on BBC's Persian service, which is a part of BBC. The BBC was content to tap into this and to broadcast this. And the reason is this was of a piece, because we know that one of the great effects that hastened the downfall of the Shah was the rise of Jimmy Carter. Because Jimmy Carter, he was a naive liberal, and he said, well, if they just give more freedom to the Iranian people, then they will avoid nasty problems. It was naive, but he forced the Shah's hands. And for that reason, the Shah and his fearsome secret police, which was called Savak, was not able to stop a few things, the propaganda of Khomeini coming in. Famously, he spread his propaganda through cassette tapes. And people who don't remember the cassette tapes from Ravad Yosef, again, Lahavdil, which came massive numbers across Israel in the 80s and 90s, people like that are going to be unaware what it is to have the ability of this recording technology, which seems primitive now in the digital and internet era, but it achieved great penetration in Iran. And then at one point, there was something like episodes were going around and being distributed in 600,000 cassettes, listened to an estimated 6 million of Iran's 36 million people. Those are enormous, enormous numbers. And that was how Khomeini was able to reach from exile in Paris deep into Iran and start building his legitimacy and grassroots power. And just because of Western naivety, they were not able to stop that. There was frowned on that the Shah's forces shouldn't stop that type of thing. But that hastened the regime's downfall. And for me, one of the big questions when we talk about today, behind the times, is one of the big questions is, are we being similarly Western wishful thinking in assuming that the population is ready to overthrow and so much detest these Islamists? I'm not so sure about that. I'm not so sure because we know that the West has consistently underestimated the appeal of Islam and the appeal of conservatism over there. It may be that people want to move on from it, but I doubt that they're ready for a full-fledged Western-orientated regime. So that's my own personal takeaway from this aspect of history. But the key fact is, looking back in the late 70s, right up to the brink, the West missed everything. Famously, Washington believed that the Shah's Iran was fundamentally stable. December 1977, Jimmy Carter famously called Iran an island of stability. And he was echoing the dominant view inside the White House and the CIA, that the unrest was containable, the security services were all-powerful, the opposition was marginal. And that was happening even in the summer of 1978, as strikes crippled Iran's oil industry, and millions were pouring into the street in support of Khomeini and calling for the Shah to leave. The CIA insisted that nothing was going to happen, and the Shah, in fact, would rule for years to come. What a miss. What a blunder. And that illusion collapsed spectacularly in November 1979, where the US embassy was taken over. And there's a great anecdote out there which actually illustrates the way in which real-world consequences can happen in these cases. The Iranian Revolution gave us the office micro shredder that you have today, in which papers are shredded, a lot of them kind of cut into very, very, very small pieces. The true story behind it is as follows. As the US embassy is going to be taken over, as the Shah falls in November 1979, American diplomats are scrambling to get these huge amounts of classified cables, all basically the CIA's archives, into these old-fashioned shredders which only cut things into strips. And they left behind bags of long paper ribbons. What actually happened? Those revolutionary students, some of whom, they flood into the US embassy, take US diplomats hostage, and that triggers the hostage crisis, which in fact lasted for more than a year, weakened and eventually brought down Jimmy Carter. And some of the students go and they find these bags of communications. Well, the CIA thinks that they're shredded, but they didn't bargain with Persian carpet weavers, Because, as the anecdote says, what happens is that the new regime drafts in these women who are skilled in weaving, which obviously calls for very precise handiwork, and they painstakingly reassemble documents by laying things side by side, little strips, the margins and the fonts and the phrasing. And over the course of months and a long time, hundreds of them are working on this, and they reconstruct the cables, which turn out to be very, very good propaganda for the regime. Very embarrassing for the CIA, for Israel, and for America, because it shows the deep penetration and the way in which basically the Shah's regime was riddled, was basically propped up by the CIA and by Israel. And the consequences are deadly because many agents are exposed and they're able to go on a purge and find thousands of former agents who, if they hadn't been exposed, perhaps would have stayed around and be able to act for the West as agents within them, but they were captured and executed. And for me, the takeaway from there is the West is really never good at understanding what's going on in the Middle East. It often mistakes a few modernizers and even many modernizers for public opinion. The second takeaway is, as Ronen Bergman, who is a historian of Israel's security services and Mossad, he writes that the micro-shredder was born from that. For Israel, the collapse of the Shah's regime was a disaster, but also something of a miracle. Well, let's start with the disaster. Well, that's obvious because in the last years of the Shah, he'd come to depend all the more on Israel. As Jimmy Carter starts to pressurize him to ease up on the protesters, he's scared of getting his flow of weapons cut off. And so Iran, under the Shah's security chiefs and Israelis' top security echelon, start working secretly on advanced projects. And they were obviously with deep but largely hidden strategic partnership, which involved intelligence sharing and about energy, that means oil, and also regional security. And so that was based on a close cooperation between Savak, which is the secret police, and Israel's Mossad. Israel, in fact, helped train Iran's security services. And they shared intelligence on the common enemies like, Arab enemies, Palestinian militants, and also about the Soviets. Because remember that Israel is very, very scared of the Soviet Union, and so is Iran, which shares a border with them. And what happens over there is actually one of the most tangible signs of the ties between them was a pipeline, which went from Eilat to Ashkelon, and it was a secret 50-50 partnership between Israel and Iran, which enabled Iran to sell its oil to Europe while bypassing the Suez Canal. Remember that the Suez Canal is the gateway to Europe, but it is under the control of the enemies of the Iranians, who were the Egyptians. And there were many, many different other programs as well. So although Iran officially had no ties, the relationship was very, very close at the top. That's how the Shah saw Israel as an ally. And this is where that's a disaster, because some of these major, major ties were lost overnight. And from the column of allies, Iran is flipped into the column of Israel's enemies and foes, and in fact becomes one of the most, perhaps the most radical enemy. But where does the miracle come in? Where is the near miracle? Well, Mossad historian Ronen Bergman says that the collapse of the Shah was so quick that the major military programs Israel had already undertaken, including nuclear-capable ballistic missiles they were working on to supply Iran, advanced fighter jets, and even a nuclear weapon, they were all cut off before they'd reached maturity. And if the force, as Ronen Bergman, had been slower a couple of years down the line, Israel may have confronted a nuclear-capable foe. So when the Shah escapes in early 1979, many Jews didn't take it seriously. They'd heard things like before that the Shah's in trouble, but then the Islamists took over for real, and they did something which shocks everyone. They arrest the billionaire head of the Jewish community, Habib El-Ghanian, and after a show trial, they execute him and they hang him. And that lit the fire under the Iranian Jewish community. They obviously understood that it's a terrible thing. Rabbi Shofet of Los Angeles remembers this El-Ghanian, and he said he did many good things for the people, Jews and non-Jews. He used to build a home for each of his workers. He was generous to everyone. But they accused him of being a Zionist and shot him. And obviously that was a message, a strong message to the Jewish community to back off and indeed to become what it eventually has become today, which is a community that keeps a very low profile and would never dare of any collaboration with Israel because it's too dangerous. And Rabbi Shofet remembers overnight what happened, the change. He says that the attitude of the non-Jews changed. Jews were once again officially untouchable, meaning Muslims believed they contaminated whatever they touched. That had been the case in the Qajari anti-Semitic dynasty before the Pahlavis. Before the revolution, Rabbi Shofet said, he would go to the market, choose his own fruits and vegetables. Now when he reached to feel a fruit, he felt the hand of the vendor close over his own. Don't touch, Jew, the seller snarled. And the Jews obviously began leaving in droves, and they went wherever they could. Went to Los Angeles, they already had a small presence there. They went to other cities, and the Jewish Federation of North America and other agencies helped them. And Chabad played a role, rescued thousands of children. But there's also a major, very dramatic story. Ner Yisrael's Rabbi Neuberger was involved in a network that helped tens of thousands of Jews escape Iran. And in Baltimore, Ner Yisrael Yeshiva accepted many Talmidim as well from there. If you go into Bati Medrash in America and Israel today, you'll find them. Talmidei Chachamim and Rabbonim, often older, with Persian accents. Their emergence is a dramatic story of rescue and return to Torah observance, and it's also the story of a partnership between two great Torah lay leaders, Rabbi Moshe Grylak of the Agudah and Rabbi Naftali Neuberger of Ner Yisrael. And Jonathan Rosenblum, in his book on Rabbi Shara, has a fantastic chapter on the Iranian rescue. He begins by saying, the Chazal say, in Gemara Megillah, says that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is makdim refuah l'mako, places, brings into existence a cure before he brings a disease. Rarely, writes Jonathan Rosenblum, has this been so clear as in the case of Iranian Jewry. There's a fascinating story over here. Because Rabbi Neuberger was in place in the last years of the Shah's regime, already developing connections that enabled them to rescue these large numbers of Iranian Jews. And the story begins with Rabbi Neuberger, who in 1975 receives a call from his wife's nephew, Rabbi Yosef Leib Shochatovitz, who was then heading the Otzar Torah school in Iran. Otzar Torah being actually the Haredi religious answer to the Alliance. It was a network of schools, Morocco, different places, Tunisia, anywhere across the Arab and Muslim world, basically trying to provide a Torah education there. And as I say, it's a response to the French secularist Jewish Alliance, a network of schools. And so he's there, Rabbi Shochatovitz is there in Iran, head of the Otzar Torah institutions, and he described to Rabbi Neuberger the decline of religious life under the Shah. And why? Because the Shah is told by his security services, the Savak, that it's the religious seminaries and religious institutions which are responsible for the fundamentalism arising among young people. And his security services tell them that the best thing to do is to close them. No religious schools, no religious fundamentalist problem, he's told. So, what does he do? He tries to close all religious schools, Jewish schools. Now, this is so typical, in which Jews become collateral damage of a secularist attempt to stem the advance of fundamentalist Islam. We can see it happening in Europe today, by the way. We have in Belgium, Shechita was banned, not because of the Jews, but because of the Muslims, and as an attempt to crack down on the Muslims. And the same reason that Jews have run into problems with the yarmulkes, because the European countries trying to ban the hijab. And the same reason why now that Mila is under threat, including an emerging threat in Britain, because of the attempt to, obviously, to check the Islamization of Britain. This is a classic case of Jews with collateral damage. And that brings, in the mid-1970s, Rabbi Neuberger to Iran. He accepts an invitation from Rabbi Salomon Sassoon, who was a patron of Otzar Torah. And Rabbi Sassoon famously was a great Talmuder of Desla and a very, very wealthy man. And so he says, let's travel to Iran to negotiate with the Shah to reverse the ban on religious schooling. And Rabbi Neuberger goes together with a delegation of senators, and it's the senators who are going to be listened to. Obviously, we see that this is an American dependency, basically, and senators have clout with the Shah. So whilst he's there, Rabbi Neuberger sees that there is the low ebb to which Iranian Jewry is now at. He sees that there's total lack of vitality in the religious life. And he has a great idea. He says, well, let's bring over some young men who are going to become Rabbonim. They're going to learn in Ner Yisrael, and then they go back to spread, be Marabit's Torah, to spread Yiddishkeit. And in fact, it takes place in 1977, which is just a year and a half before the fall of the Shah. First group of Iranians arrive in Ner Yisrael, and a second group arrives a year later. It was actually Rabbi Neuberger's sons, who was the Rosh Yeshiva of Ner Yisrael, in an interview, another Mishpacha interview, with Yisrael Besser, who says that Rabbi Naftali Neuberger sensed a tremendous respect for, he saw that America was a brand name. You can offer to these Besser mentioned, these upwardly mobile Iranian Jews, what can you offer them? They're doing well locally. Well, how are you going to get them to America? America itself was an attraction. That was one thing they were willing to say. If they can go and study in America, that's a good thing. And so, says Rabbi Neuberger's sons, a longtime member of the Nahola of the yeshiva, Ner Yisrael, recalls a meeting where Rabbi Neuberger shared his vision with other Rosh Yeshiva. The sons said, everyone disagreed with him. It was unanimous. We felt that a few isolated Iranian students would never open up to what we were teaching. It was doomed to fail. So apparently, though, Rabbi Neuberger agreed with himself, because the next month there weren't 2 Iranian Talmidim, there were 12. And Rabbi Neuberger was proven right, because these Talmidim came and they soaked up everything that the yeshiva had to offer. And in fact, they went into some of the initial cohort very quickly. Within a few months, started going into Kirov amongst the other Persians and Iranians, Jews who were in different places. And from that original group of Iranian boys, many Talmidei Chachamim were produced. And what happened is, years later, this is Rabbi David Zargari, who was mentioned earlier, alongside Rabbi Shofet. He's a rabbi in Pico in Los Angeles. He was part of this first group, and he mentored some of the second wave. It reached a point where this classic Litvish yeshiva was so flooded with Iranian boys, there were 130 of them after the revolution, that people took the initials of the yeshiva, the NIRC, Ner Yisrael Rabbinical College, and changed it to Neuberger's Iranian Refugee Camp. When the Shah fell, the refugee and rescue work of Rabbi Neuberger and the Aguda expanded dramatically. They hired a whole staff, and Rabbi Scherer in Manhattan worked with senior officials to reshape America's immigration policy around them in order to allow the 8,000 to 10,000 Iranian Jews already in the United States whose visas were expiring. They had meetings at the highest levels of the State Department, so they were able to change the policy without any uproar, so as not to risk retaliation against these people's relatives in Iran. Now, what happens is that things dramatically worsen in 1980 with the outbreak of the Iran-Iraq war, because we have to remember that Iraq is a massively powerful, well-armed state under Saddam Hussein, and it invades Iran. And Iran is in very, very, very desperate situation. The armed forces were reduced to sending children and young people to the front lines, basically unarmed, as cannon fodder against the Iraqis. And so they start relying on smuggling routes through Turkey and Pakistan. And Rabbi Moshe Grylak, had to intervene with the Turkish to stop them repatriating Jews. And he was able to, Rabbi Scherer had his relationship with Congressman Stephen Solarz, who was close to the Turkish ambassador, and he was able to, with that intervention, to save Jews. And ultimately, the setup between Rabbi Neuberger and the Aguda's work expanded to something called the Iranian Rescue Committee, which worked for a few years. It was under the auspices of Aguda's Israel, raising millions of dollars and smuggling out thousands of Jews through Iran and eventually onto Vienna, where there was yeshivas going on there. And by the late 1980s, dozens of Iranian rabbis and hundreds of B'nai Torah had emerged in America. And this was the incredible irony that Jonathan Rosenblum points out, that the revolution and the disaster of Iranian Jewry led to the revival of that community, because more than 20 communities and institutions were established, and Persian Jewry, once in decline, emerged stronger and more vibrant when it was exiled from Persia than it had been in Iran. And for me, there's a takeaway also from over here, because if you remember at the beginning of this episode, we have the great scene of the Bluzhever Rebbe saying, I cannot paskin about whether to save them because the memory of losing or having this very same question for his daughter weighed so heavily on him. It was only 3.5 decades after the end of the Holocaust, but it highlighted the great gulf between the Holocaust rescue efforts, when Jews, especially from Jews, had so little access and power and influence at the highest levels where it counted in the State Department and in the White House. And decades later, the Jews, the maturing of the American Frum community was able to weigh in, and in general, the maturing of the Jewish community was able. And for me, this raises a question. When we look at the experience of the Iranian Jewish community once now trapped behind, let's call it an Iran curtain, basically in a regime that is, is capable of closing off all communications and in which Jews have to shelter and hide from the terrible things happening outside, raises for me a question worth thinking about. just how many other Jewish communities are living on the edge in places that could easily slam the doors once again. Incredibly, and I say this is literally incredible, alongside the secret efforts to help Iranian Jews escape was one of the ultimate ironies, forgotten bits of history often, that right through the 1980s, Israel was arming and training the ayatollahs regime. Its goals were to retain influence and keep a door open that perhaps salvage a relationship. Also, to actually help the regime turning somewhat of a blind eye to the Jews fleeing. Another motivation was to counter Iraq, right? Because we forget, in hindsight, that Saddam was a major preoccupation. He was a major threat to Israel. It's only in hindsight he's this helpless, bearded fugitive found in a drainpipe by Allied forces in Baghdad and then hanged. In real time, he was a global threat and a mortal threat to Israel. As we saw, he was building a nuclear reactor in Iraq, which had to be bombed. He was developing poison gas and nerve agents. And eventually, he actually, in the 1991 Gulf War, fired 39 Scuds, these enormously destructive missiles, at Israel. So there was every reason to act on the principle of my enemy's enemy is my friend. And so they interacted with the devil itself, which was Ayatollah Khomeini. And there was obviously a motivation also to get what money could be got out of the Iranian. If the Iranians needed something, then it would provide cash for Israel's own armaments program. So what actually happened, that after Iraq invades Iran in 1980, Israel emerges, totally paradoxically, as one of Tehran's most important lifelines. Obviously, the Iranians needed all the help they can get, although they denied anything. But behind the scenes, they sent a massive flood of arms, much of it American-made, from 1981 onwards. It was transferred to the Iranians and largely paid for in oil. And estimates of what the arms sales were hundreds of millions of dollars a year, at least, possibly more. Analysts say that it was Israeli help and intervention that kept the Iranians in the game. And there were actually some familiar names there. One of the big international Saudi arms dealer, Adnan Khashoggi, whose people might remember, whose nephew, other Khashoggi, was, an anti-Israel and anti-Saudi figure, was chopped up in the Saudi embassy in Turkey in a scandal a few years ago. And that was his uncle, Adnan Khashoggi, was a well-known arms dealer. And in fact, captured PLO weapons from Israel's 1982 Lebanon war, also ended up in Tehran. So it's actually going the other way from, now we have the Palestinians being armed by the Iranians, then it was the Iranians being armed effectively by the Palestinians, although they didn't know it. And it's crazy to think of, but there were sometimes hundreds of Israeli advisors and technicians quietly working away inside Iran, maintaining jets, training crews, and even as the Iranian crowds were chanting, "Death to Israel," the big Satan, the little Satan, that was the public. But in private, it was different. And famously, there was the Iran-Contra affair in which Israel was acting as a go-between for U.S. arms shipments to Iran. And the logic was, again, from the American point of view, to prevent Iraq from winning, preserve leverage inside Tehran, keep open channels to potential pragmatists. And America had an interest in that because they needed the spare cash to keep away from Congress this illegal cash to funnel into, I think, CIA operations, clandestine illegal operations in South America. And when it blew up, it was a very dirty business, the Iran-Contra affair. But Israel was the middleman in the 1980s. And apparently it was Iranian intelligence that provided the location and details on Saddam's nuclear program in Iraq, which was taken out in a strike ordered by Menachem Begin in 1982. And there was another aspect of that whole relationship because there was oil. Oil, which we know had flowed through the Eilat-Ashkelon pipeline before the revolution, was marketed on the world market by Israel. And so there were others who were caught up. Mark Rich from Switzerland was caught up in that and was sanctioned by the US Treasury. But I think it's possible for me, over here we have the strangest truth of the Iran-Iraq war was that Israel was publicly being denounced as this little Satan by Tehran. It's quietly helping keep Iran in the war, and only to see that the same Iranian regime turns everything that Israel has given it into a permanent strategic war against it. Takeaways over here, into the modern world over here, it's hard not to think of the Hamas, with Israel's murky relationship with basically a foe Qatar, which supports Hamas, and yet Israel was busy, had a financial relationship with it, trade, etc. It's the old story of getting your hands dirty in the pursuit of legitimate objectives, tied up the Iranian ayatollahs and Israel's leaders, even as they were locked in a fight. So that's an incredible unknown story that was going on throughout the 1980s. The archives, Bibi Netanyahu's opponents like to say, don't lie. In 2013, in an Israeli paper, there was an article, one of many similar, which mocked Bibi's long obsession with Iran and its nuclear program. In the article, it wrote a retrospective all the way to another paper, the same paper 20 years before, in 1993. Back in 1993, Benjamin Netanyahu said the following thing in the newspaper. The most dangerous threat to Israel's existence today does not lie in the Arab states, but in Iran, he wrote. The prevailing assessment is that by 1999, Iran will produce its first nuclear bomb. Iran's rulers repeatedly declare that this will be an Islamic bomb, and that its first target will be Israel. Thus, Iran's president, Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani, said in 1991, Muslims must cooperate in the production of atomic bombs. His deputy, Mohajirani, adds, the purpose of Iran's nuclear armament is to build, together with its Muslim sisters, an atomic bomb in order to place it opposite the Israeli atom. Bibi, writing in 1993, said, it is our duty to ensure in advance that the Iranian regime does not acquire the tools required to realize this aspiration. We must not rely on the assumption that rational considerations regarding a possible Israeli response will deter this fanatical mentality. Deterrence alone is not an adequate Israeli response to the danger of an Islamic bomb. Israel must act vigorously to thwart this danger to its very existence. I mean, the words speak for themselves. This is Bibi in writing in 1993, and this is in fact echoing a speech given the year before, 1992, as a simple Chaver Knesset member of the Knesset, in which he'd said exactly the same thing. Bibi warned for decades. He was the prophet, as it were, the secular prophet of the rise of the Iranian threat. And in so many ways, we're actually living in Bibi's world, a world in which we think of Iran as the foremost threat. But if you've listened to what we've said before, this came as something noteworthy to Bibi's contemporaries. And for years they would accuse him of fear-mongering and talking up the threat from Iran as a way to distract from the Palestinian problem, as a way, in fact, to gain in the political sense. And this was, as we've seen, Yediot, was the line for decades of Bibi's opponents on the left, that you are just fear-mongering, in fact. And this is where in 2015, Yaron Druckmann, writing in the same paper Yediot, talks about the revenge of the archives. He says, for more than 20 years, Benjamin Netanyahu has been warning about Iran. According to his forecasts, Iran was supposed to possess a nuclear bomb already by the end of the 1990s. And the correspondent goes on to write that Oded Yidon of Jerusalem responded to Netanyahu in letters to the editor back in 1993, writing that Netanyahu was frightening us with all stories of Iran's nuclear bomb and the Iranian threat to the entire world. Yinon argued that the threat described was at worst only potential, while then IDF Chief of Staff Ehud Barak stated that there was no real Iranian threat at the time. Yinon questioned why Iran should be harnessed for Netanyahu's electoral needs instead of focusing on domestic problems, such as unemployment, the economy, and society. That's a classic take, one that held for decades. And the column went on to quote someone who actually turned out to be right. A certain Arnold Beichmann, a researcher and columnist of the Washington Post, who wrote that Netanyahu would not hesitate to launch a preemptive strike against Iran. How prescient that was, how true that was, only decades later. And then the report by this self-same Arnold Beichmann, this expert for the Washington Post, you get a glimpse of the narrative of moderates versus fundamentalists, this great truism. You get a sight of this moderates versus fundamentalists idea, which is one of the great ideas that underpinned analysis of Iran for decades. And so Arnold Beichmann writes, the report of Iran's weapons of mass destruction program comes at a time when the mullah's regime has been peddling a quote-unquote moderate propaganda line, adopted since the election of Mohammad Khatami as Iran's president 20 months ago. Since he quoted Alexis de Tocqueville in an interview for the Western press, it was immediately assumed that Khatami's election foretold a new shining day in Iran's relations with the West. Far from it, writes his Beichmann. Because immediately on this election, Khatami is said to have created a group of science and technology advisors to supervise the regime's chemical, biological, nuclear weapons programs with headquarters in Tehran. And this dynamic was a staple of Iranian analysis for years. This idea, but he quotes de Tocqueville, he must be moderate. Or, they wear suits, he talks normal English. They don't want war, these are moderates. This was the line that was peddled by everyone, by the Western press and in certain parts of the Israeli left, that swooned every time the so-called moderates in Tehran made some noises of being less fundamentalist than the real fundamentalists. But the takeaway is this is the same behavior that we're seeing all over the world. Ironically, the liberals who will believe any casualty figures that are released by Hamas about Israel in Gaza, but they will disbelieve anything that the Iranian opposition are saying about the tens of thousands potentially mowed down over there. The liberals have a different policy on Iran. And what they want to see and what they're bent on seeing and desperate to see is that this mirage of reformists versus hardliners. And the reason that this is such a mirage is simply because even the reformists were only acting within the framework of the regime. And all of that, they did not want to bring down the regime. They wanted to loosen it slightly. Does Israel really want the ayatollahs regime to fall? Well, what type of question is that, you might ask? Of course they do. The answer is that yes, but it will cost the country. North, in fact, of $1.2 billion. Because for decades, the ayatollahs' accountants have been pursuing Israel through the international arbitration courts for hundreds of millions owed that were advanced by the Shah to the Israelis for oil supply and for all sorts of weapons projects that we discussed above. That has been going through arbitration in front of a Swiss court. Israel's response? There's no way that we're doing business with those committed to wipe us out. Change regime and then we'll talk. Iran's response has been, what do you mean you don't do business with us? You did, in fact, right through the 1980s. And the record, as we've seen, shows that they're right. Now that legal battle away from the eyes of the media illustrates just how strange has been the relationship between Israel and Iran since the Shah's fall in 1979. That bit of history and fun fact about the past and possibly the future brings us to a question. Where does all this end? And here I have a few thoughts. Number one, we don't know, but what comes next, obviously, surely better than the current regime. And if and when this regime falls, as all regimes, such regimes eventually do, this will be a great historic vindication for Bibi, the man who put the threat of Iran on the international table, persisted, refused to back down even when he was shamed and mocked and called an obsessive for his pains. He's played a historic role and he will go down in history for this. But, and here are a few qualifications. Number one is, I think, that Khomeinism will actually die hard. Westerners, as we've seen, have long engaged with this regime and with the ideas of Ayatollah Khomeini with a large helping of wishful thinking. They were so desperate to see modernity that they couldn't see that the country, that Iran, in fact, was not a thoroughly modern country. And now if you look at the large crowds who actually come out in support of the regime, you think back to before the revolution, and you have to ask yourself, is there a wave of secularism sweeping the country? Maybe. But what we've seen is the latest protests were seen now to have died down and been stamped out more like by the regime which turned off the internet. We're frustrated with poverty, and that ultimately could be the regime's downfall. So perhaps we'll see a leader ease aside, and the regime might even cling on in some form. So even if it falls, will it be a great victory? I think the bottom line is this is a country genuinely torn between Islamists, those who want a more conservative past, and those who want a more open future. Khomeinism, I think it's fair to say, has certain roots and won't go easily. There's a second qualification, I think, and it regards the Abraham Accords. Right through the 1970s, Iran stood with Israel against the Arab world. And now Israel stands with the Arabs against a radical Iran. But think ahead. If one day Iran comes closer to Israel, could we see the glue behind the Abraham Accords dissolve? Well, when I asked Israel's former ambassador to the United States, Ron Dermer, who was actually one of the architects of the Abraham Accords years ago, I asked him about this, and he said, well, the glue goes far deeper and obviously more encompassing than simply a common enemy. There's more to the links between the Arab world and Israel today than just my enemy's enemy is my friend. But I don't know. I don't have his level of expertise, but I think we could see that as Iran drifts back towards Israel, the old patterns reassert themselves and the Abraham Accords begin to be questioned. That's my own private view and suspicion. But there's one last thought. We don't know Hashem's plans. We see something strange. As Iran clearly sinks, there's a rise of a new axis, Turkey, Pakistan, and Saudi Arabia. Seemingly, until Mashiach comes, we'll be surrounded by enemies and needing those tefillas for the future of Israel. But I think Hashem, who ensured that, as we've seen in this episode, that the Shah fell too quickly for Khomeini to get a nuclear weapon, who sent Rabbi Neuberger to pave the way for rescue of the Iranian Jewry years before it was needed, and who returned an ancient community to Torah knowledge, he'll protect us through whatever comes next. Thank you for joining me in Behind the Times. Until next time.